I want to tell you a story. Actually, I have two stories to tell you. One is a personal story about myself, which we'll get to in a little bit, while the other story is about one of Islam's most revered Sahaba, companions of the Prophet ﷺ, Umar ibn Khattab, may Allah be pleased with him. Now, just in case you don't know who Umar is, let me give you a quick description of this man. Umar ibn Khattab in general was an amazing man and an amazing Muslim. He was also a very close and important companion to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And most importantly, he was Islam's second rightly guided leader after the Prophet passed ﷺ. But how did this important figure embrace Islam? Well, in a nutshell, Umar was the nephew of Abu Jahl, one of the most notorious enemies of Islam and the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. The reports we have indicate that one day Abu Jahl went up to the Prophet ﷺ while he was praying at the Kaaba and did something to massively disrespect him. Well, later that day, word got back to Prophet Muhammad's uncle Hamza as to what happened to the Prophet ﷺ. And since Hamza was in charge of the Prophet's clan, the Prophet's family, he took this as a personal disrespect himself. So Hamza decides to go over to Abu Jahl's house and confront him about the situation that he heard about. While there, they have a very heated exchange, and Hamza ends up leaving. And then even later that day, Umar got word about what happened to his uncle Abu Jahl, and he becomes enraged. He basically says, that's it, I'm done. I'm done with Islam, I'm done with this guy Muhammad, I'm done. Umar basically comes to the conclusion that it's this Muhammad and this Islam that's the source of the disrespect to his family. And he sees that this Muhammad and this Islam is destroying the fabric of the Meccan society that he loves. So he decides at that moment, I'm going to deal with it myself. Enough of this back and forth. He grabs his sword and he heads over to Muhammad's house. As he's heading in the direction of Muhammad's house, he just so happens to run into his best friend Naim. Naim knows Umar and he sees that crazy look in his face and he stops him and he says, hey, my friend, what's going on? Why so angry? Umar responds by telling Naim, I'm done with this Islam nonsense. I'm going to go right now and kill Muhammad. Now, what Umar did not know at that moment is that Naim had already secretly become Muslim. So upon hearing this, Naim, of course, thought to himself, my God, I got to do something to defuse this madman. He first appeals to his life by saying, if you kill Muhammad, then his clan is going to come after you. It's basically a suicide mission. Don't do it. Umar insists he does not care, suicide or not, it's worth it to do this to save Mecca. So Naim at that moment decides to appeal to his honor, something that Arabs back then took very seriously because Umar didn't know that his sister and her husband had also secretly become Muslim. So Naim tells Umar, shouldn't you go clean up your own house first before you go clean up Muhammad's house? I heard your sister and her husband became Muslim too. Umar of course says, what? And he turns around and storms over to his sister's house. I suppose Naim did throw another fellow Muslim under the bus, but what are you supposed to do? He had to protect the Prophet at all costs. I would have done the same. Umar then storms into his sister's house. At the time, her and her husband were sitting there reading the Quran to each other, Surah Taha to be exact. And when she saw Umar storm in, she immediately hid the parchment that had the verses on them. Umar then started to argue with her husband, and this of course escalated and he started to beat on his brother-in-law. His sister, of course, didn't want this to happen, so she got between the two men, and Umar unintentionally slapped her to the ground. At this point, when he saw what he did to his sister, his rage finally stopped. He then walked back and sat on the side of the bed, and he asked his sister to show him what she was hiding. They had a few words back and forth. He took off his sword, he calmed down, he then washed his hands, and then finally his sister agreed to give him the parchment with the verses on them. And Umar for the first time read the few verses of Surah Taha. He read Quran for the first time. After reading these few verses, he took a long pause, then looked up at his sister, and he said, La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. He gave the Shahada and became Muslim right on that spot. Of course, I left out tons of details in the story. This is just a quick street version, as I said. For the real full version, please click on the description below. But I wanted to share this important tale with you. Why is it important? Well, let's keep it in the back of our mind for one moment while I share with you how I came back to Islam. Of course, I say come back to Islam because unlike Umar, I was raised in a Muslim household. My parents did teach me the basics, pray, fast, Prophet Muhammad is the last and final messenger, etc. But when I became an adult, 18, 19, 20-ish, I did go off the rails a little bit. Actually, a lot of it. May Allah forgive me. But I do want to share this with you. There's a lesson in it. It was my first year in college and I had a very robotic life then. All I did every day is go to school, come home, study for a few hours, have dinner, then go straight to my friend's house and we'd go to his basement and we'd just chill. Well, one day when I walked into his basement, unbeknownst to me, he went and bought a pair of Technique 1200s. You gotta understand, if you want to become a DJ back then, you needed a pair of Technique 1200s. So I convinced him that night to let me give him half the money for the set. That way we both owned them, but he had to keep them at his house because my dad would never allow me to keep them at my house. To my dad, college was everything. If he saw me wasting even a moment on those things, he would kill me. So that night he agreed, and boom, both of us declared, nah, we're DJs. And that was it. If I wasn't working, I used to valet on the weekends, or studying for college, I was in his basement mixing. Because I'm one of those kind of guys that says, if you're gonna do something, then you have to give it your all. In other words, I didn't just want to be good at mixing, I want to become the best DJ around. And what's wrong with that? I thought to myself, as long as I keep up with my prayers and keep up with my studies, this new hobby will stay in his basement and it'll be super innocent. But that's the problem. It didn't stay in his basement. It's just human nature to try to upgrade your skills and push it to its limits. And one of the limits is you think of ways to try to monetize your skill. So that's what I did. I monetized it by making mixtapes. I started selling these mixtapes out of gas stations, tanning salons, record stores, basically everywhere in the city. And of course, you put your number on the mixtape, which eventually led to people calling the number on the mixtape and doing what? Calling me and paying me to DJ parties. And that's when my real problem started. See, nobody wakes up and just decides, you know what, today's the day I'm going to commit all types of haram. I'm just going to go crazy. No. It always starts small. Like you open one door, right? And before you know it, you open another door, and another, and another. And before you know it, you've opened dozens of haram doors. And that's what happened to me. Within a few years span, I found myself drowning in haram. May Allah forgive me. And then there was this one particular party that I want to share with you. At this point, all the parties / haram I did were always outside the city that I lived in. This, of course, was by design on my part because I still had shame. I knew what I was doing was wrong. And this particular party was also outside the city. But unbeknownst to me, the people in the party, they were all from my city. I'm talking childhood friends, distant cousins, all kinds of Muslims that I knew from my own neighborhood. And the amount of haram I saw that night was next level. Right or wrong, I do not know. But it's one thing to see a bunch of strangers commit haram. But when you see your own people acting like this, it affected me very deeply. The next day when I woke up, I knew 100% I cannot keep doing this. I had to change my lifestyle. But how? I kept saying to myself, how? I've committed so much haram already. How can I possibly go back and close all the doors I've opened? And that's why the story of Umar ibn Khattab, may Allah be pleased with him, is so dear to me. I remember that story that morning, and I said to myself, here's a man who was about to commit one of the most reprehensible sins you could possibly commit. He was about to kill the Prophet of Allah. Are you crazy? But within a flash, he had a moment and he turned out to be one of the best Muslims we've ever seen. In other words, I thought to myself, if he can pull himself out of that hole, and his hole was way deeper than mine in my opinion, then I could do it too. And I thought to myself that morning, what am I missing? There's something in his story that I do not have. And then it hit me. Remember, Umar was a master poet, and by extension, a master of Arabic language at that time. So when he read those verses for the first time, his brain recognized the linguistic miracle that is Quran. In other words, his brain at that moment established an intellectual connection with Quran. And that's what I recognized that I was missing. So I decided to pull the band-aid off. And after breakfast that morning, I called my boy Samra up, who was a DJ, kinda. And I told him, come right now. I want you to come right now in my house and take everything. Come take all my equipment. Of course, he didn't believe me at first. He thought I'm being crazy. But I was insistent. I go, you gotta come within 30 minutes or I'm gonna call someone else. So he came within 20. Him and his two brothers came and they took everything. I'm talking my records, my equipment. I just told them take everything. And every 3 minutes he'd look at me and like, are you sure? Are you sure? I go, Habibi, take it all right now, please. And after they left, I got dressed and I said, that's it. I'm gonna right now figure out my intellectual connection. But the problem is, I don't really speak Arabic, and more importantly, I don't read and write Arabic. So I couldn't dive into Quran like Umar did that day and find a connection that way. But then I thought about it a little deeper. It wasn't the verses of Surah Al-Taha per se. It was that just he connected with Quran. He had an intellectual connection with Quran. So I said, you know, the most logical thing to do is for me to go dive into Quran and find my intellectual connection. But even in English, the Quran is overwhelming. It has hundreds of pages and hundreds of ideas. I really didn't know where to start. So I decided I needed advice. And I called up an old friend. And thankfully, the old friend answered my call because ever since I went off the rails, I kind of didn't hang out with him no more. But I knew he was a good guy, and I knew he understood Islam much deeper than me. So I said, let me call him. Thankfully, he accepted my call and he invited me over, and we started talking. And he knew that I was studying to get my master's, and he knew that I love numbers, and he knew that Danny didn't need a lecture. What he needs is knowledge. So after talking for a few minutes, he's like, I'll be right back. He went inside, came out, and he gave me this book. And he made me a deal. He goes, if you read this book, come back and we'll talk about it afterwards. And then we'll discuss any questions you might have. So I accepted his deal. I took the book, knocked it out in 3 days. And at the end of those 3 days, something interesting happened to me. Before reading that book, Islam at that moment for me was just rituals. Pray, fast, one day you're going to go to Hajj. I didn't know that Islam talks about all these other things. I didn't know, for instance, that Islam had its own economic structure and economic rules that rivals capitalism and shames communism. I didn't know that Islam taught us about government structure and corporate structure and talked about trade rules and foreign policy. I didn't know that Islam set up the social structure for every part of life, like the public versus private sphere or the interaction between husband and wife. And that can go on and on. My point is that at that moment, at the end of those 3 days, I finally saw Islam for what it was. It wasn't just a bunch of rituals, even though the rituals are an important aspect of Islam, but it was so much more. It was at that moment that I saw Islam as a complete way of life. And more importantly, it was at that moment that I finally felt I had an intellectual connection with Quran, or at least a part of Quran, enough for me to recognize it, respect it, and start following it. And that's the point of this video. For others listening to hopefully, inshallah, get inspired not only by Umar's story, but also mine, because I know that there's a lot of people listening that were just like I was and still am, because I'm not perfect. Quite frankly, it's not easy for Muslims to live in this kind of environment. But no matter how much sin you've committed, it's never too late to dig yourself out of the hole. And the only way to do that is through Quran. And I don't mean just go open up Quran and read the verses. Of course you should do that. That's very important. But not only do that, but also try to connect with its concepts and its ideas. In other words, again, intellectually connect with Quran or some part of Quran. Because when you do that, then it becomes easy to follow its rules. And think about it logically. Isn't that how the human mind was designed? For example, I remember when I was studying my bachelor's degree, my last semester, one of the last classes I took was microbiology. And up to this point, I was getting straight A's. I had already got into pharmacy school. All I had to do is finish that semester and get at least a C in microbiology. Well, I did get my C. Actually got a C+. But I won't lie to you, that semester killed me because I hated microbiology. And after that class, I was like, you know what? I called Wayne State. I was like, I'm not going to pharmacy school. I dropped out. I'm going to find a different route in life. My point is, I didn't like microbiology. Something about that subject bored me. I just wasn't excited by it. I couldn't connect to it. And that's what I mean by, isn't that how the human mind works? You might read some verses of Quran and they just don't connect with you. You might hear a lecture and it just doesn't connect with you. But keep looking. That's the point. Keep looking. Islam is vast. It's a complete way of life. It addresses all facets of life. So whatever interests you, go pick up that and start reading that. And it's quite simple, isn't it, today? We live in an era where there's plethora of knowledge in all topics. They've already been discussed. Just go find one that interests you. Anyway, I think you see my point by now. So all I'll say is I hope you have good luck trying to find your intellectual connection with Quran. Thank you for listening. If you like this video, please be sure to check out some of my other vids on different topics in the description below.